Mr. Horsford, just to give you a heads up, you've been here before. This is second round, so you can jump in at any point. But I do want to be able to ask Ms. Nottingham, you had on your statement to finish up when Mrs. Spear was talking about your statement, there should be a consideration of the possibility of requiring treatment for conditions that may improve. The challenge of this is if there is a disability that is treatable, that's manageable, and we go to ADHD or other things, whether it may be hearing loss, whether they have hearing aids or whatever it may be, a disability that then is treatable and manageable, how is that then evaluated for long-term disability? Whether is there the possibility of, going back to Mr. Lockhart's earlier statement here, how do we get folks back into the community? If they have a disability, it is being managed, they are capable of getting back in the workforce, do we?
I think this is an area where there's possibly room for improvement. We have some conditions where the policies are maybe the listings address it. Hearing is one thing. When we measure their hearing, it's with best correction or vision as well. There are some conditions like seizures are ones that we're very specific that if they're not following prescribed treatment, then we would not allow them because most times seizures are treatable. There is an exception for following prescribed treatment. It's a good cause, and usually that is, one of them is access to medical care. So you might have condition, depression, anxiety, ADHD, some of these conditions that could very well be improved with treatment, but they don't have access to it. So the hope is when they get benefits that they could get treatment and get better. However, at CDR, many claims we see do not actually have any treatment. The failure to follow prescribed treatment is something that, from my experience, is not really used much at CDRs, and I'm wondering if that's a possibility where we could be considering that more.
Slow down. Say that last statement one more time.
The failure to follow prescribed treatment policy is not something that's really considered at CDR. I don't know if that's the direct policy on that, whether we should be or not, but in practice, it's not really followed, and I'm thinking that's a possibility of where we could be looking into that more.
I want to lean into this. If a person could improve, be in the community, be employable, if they maintain medication or treatment or whatever it may be, and they choose not to, you're saying that's not considered at that spot, or it is considered that, hey, this person still should be listed as disabled because they're not taking the treatment that has been prescribed for them?
It depends on the condition. There are some that you don't know with treatment how they would do. Some are much more likely, like I mentioned, seizure disorders. If people get treatment on that, they get better. And if not, then they should be found disabled. So we would find someone to not be found disabled because they are failing to follow prescribed treatment. However, some conditions, it's harder to tell how they would respond to treatment, like a depression or anxiety. But there is little guidance on that at this point in time on CDRs and when that would apply outside of a few conditions.
If I might just add one point, and that is, we do take into consideration a person's compliance with treatment, and we do have tools to cease benefits or disallow benefits if a person does not comply with treatment. But understand that for medical impairments, the failure to follow prescribed treatment is often part of the mental impairment. It's not just that the person, is trying to be obstinate, it's that they have a serious mental condition, whether it be schizophrenia or something else, that creates an intense, let's say, fear of the medication or fear of the side effects that the medication creates. So it is a difficult determination, and we'd be happy to work with NAID and anybody else to clarify it or provide training on it if that would be helpful.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily talking about the mental illnesses and such. This is a physical thing. If they have a physical disability and they choose not to take medication just because they don't feel a requirement to and say, it doesn't matter to me one way or the other, that's a more serious thing not only for the taxpayer but also for that individual and their families, obviously. And somehow we've got to have a way to be able to incentivize saying re-engage in culture. Again, I come back to what Ms. Lockhart was saying. It's a very big issue to isolate people and to be able to separate them out, and we basically discourage them from future work. Because if they're able to work, we want them to be able to re-engage in culture and be able to get back to work. But if benefits and all those things suddenly go away, there is no sliding scale, there is no possibility to be able to drift off of this, even where that was a pilot even. How do we help people that are capable of doing that actually being able to re-engage? So that's something I think we have to take a look at on how we actually can do that. Is that something you need a legislative fix on, or is that something you have administrative authority? Can we pilot something, or how do we help to be able to transition out? Ms. Lockhart, are you trying to say something on that as well?
Yeah, yes. On the compliance, I just want to add to that real quickly. We are currently working with our Department of Health, for example, with patients with sickle cell anemia. The biggest problem with barrier of care we have is compliance. It's simply getting the patients to get to the doctor and follow the protocol they're giving. It's not always a psychological issue as much as it is a socioeconomic or cultural issue. So we work with them on education to help them follow those protocols. ADHD, our chief writes on the international level the standards for that. I'm not sure he would always agree it's a disability. So I would welcome you to contact him at any time to follow up on that. Currently, Oklahoma has 19,475 children in the aid category that are receiving some sort of disability aid. My concern, as we're talking about all of this, is not are they getting disability or not, but what happens to them. Where are they going and what is their future? And within these programs, the bigger picture. That would be my question.
If I might jump in on the bigger picture, which goes back to your question about creating self-sufficiency and having people re-engage in the community and be, productive members of society. We believe at Social Security, as Ranking Member Spear said, that we need to pay the right check to the right person at the right time. That is the law, and we work hard to do that well. But we also believe that part of our mission is evolving policy and practice to support people to become self-sufficient and to re-engage. And I think at the last hearing I may have mentioned, we have a research budget, and we use that money to test new policies and demonstrations. And right now we have a couple right along the lines of what you're suggesting. PROMISE is the Promoting Readiness of Minors in Social Security program. It's an interagency effort to grant money to states around the country. There are 11 states participating, and the idea is to create community-based incentives, very similar to what Ms. Lockhart is doing, and to figure out what community supports will work to help children, in particular, re-engage and become productive potential working members of society as they age.
Let me just add that for a number of years I worked with the developmentally disabled community in my county, where what we were doing was placing adult developmentally disabled in positions in local grocery stores, at drugstores, in law firms, doing meaningful work, getting a paycheck, turning tax receivers into taxpayers, as was one of the lines that was used by this nonprofit, with great success. And they were developmentally disabled. And so I would hope that as we look at ways to just enhance the program and create greater self-sufficiency, that we would look at some of the models that exist around the country. I mean, it's not like reinventing the wheel here, but there certainly this PROMISE program, if you've got youngsters who have speech delays or ADHD, I think it would be really important when they're still minors to get them working in, getting them placed in jobs in the communities, so that if in fact 50% of them are ceasing that benefit at age 18, that there's somewhere for them to go in terms of being, valued members of society in terms of employment.
Absolutely, and the Promise program does include employment support, placement, benefit counseling, and all of those integrated supports that Ms. Lockhart was referring to. That's the point of the program. And it's not the first time that we've engaged on that front. We completed the youth transition demonstration, which targeted youths between the age of 14 and 25 and did generally the same thing. We provided community-based supports in many different locations, and it proved effective.
Well, I guess my point is I think it should be something that we do automatically with most of these youngsters, not just as pilot programs. Because if they're successful, let's fold it into the existing.
Absolutely. Our demonstrations are intended to inform the dialogue and provide the Congress with some food for thought as you consider legislative changes to the program.
It's not going to be a 16-year prototype, though, is it?
No.
That we would like to see some progress on.
We've actually completed the youth transition demonstration. The findings are publicly available, and there's some really interesting things that we found. Community-based programs do work. Promise is going to, I believe, further corroborate that evidence.
Great. Let me ask about the vocational grid. We've talked about this before. I was, let me think, I was 6, I think, when it was finalized. How are we doing on the vocational grid?
We're doing well. I think there's two pieces to this. The first is the update of the occupational information system. That's the dictionary of jobs that you mentioned has not been updated in a long time. We have partnered with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We are cooking along.
Our date for that to be
Our
complete?
date is 2016, when we believe we will have something
Still on
useful.
track, right.
We are on track,
Okay.
absolutely. The grids is a slightly different yet very much related issue.
Right.
You know, and we discussed it at the last hearing, we attempted rulemaking on the grids in the past, and we were shut down, essentially. And the reason for that is that we did not have an evidence base behind the proposal that we made to increase the age limits in the grid. And when we got questions about the disproportionate effects to minorities and other questions, we didn't have the science to back it up. We learned from that experience. We're not going to make that mistake again. So we are, as I described to you before, in the process of building our evidence base to support logical changes to the grid. And we are well underway. We are working with the Disability Research Consortium and the Library of Congress. We are engaging them in a literature review to look at how other disability systems, both internationally and in the private sector, use age, education, and work in their system so that we can learn from that and shape our own policy.
Date for that?
The initial phase of literature review from the Disability Research Consortium, we expect their report in a couple of months.
Okay. Is that something that will be available to us as well to be able to review?
Yes.
How publicly available is that?
Yeah, we can share the findings with the committee.
So we're talking July-ish, somewhere through there?
Yes. Now, understand, that's the first phase of our
Understand.
exploration.
That's getting the science out there to be able to review, and then the next part of it, after that is done, then it's a matter of starting to make the recommendations.
Exactly. Remember,
The hope to get all this together by 2016, both the vocational grid and the other recommendations, to get them to a complete proposal.
that would be ideal, yes. It really depends on what we find in the exploration. Remember that the law requires us to consider age, education, and work as part of the determination. How we do that needs to evolve over time as people work longer and so forth, but it's a very complicated analysis. So we are in the fact-finding stage.
Okay, let me ask another question we've talked about before, and that is the high rate of reversal judges for the ALJs, whether it be Judge Daughtry or any number of others there. You have CDR funds that have been allotted. You've said you're setting aside some of those for the high-priority cases. Are those some of the high-priority cases that you're actually targeting, some of these high-reversal ALJs?
Yes.
Okay, how is that coming so far?
So we have been looking at this from a legal standpoint because, you know, we try hard to respect judicial independence of our ALJs, and so there are some legal parameters that we need to work within, and we've been working hard to kind of figure out a path forward, but we believe that we are going to get to where this committee wants us to be and where we need to be by looking at the cases that have the potential of being out of policy compliance. In other words, we know what cases are problematic from a policy standpoint. And we are going to target those cases. And in doing so, we will get to a lot of the decisions that were problematic and made by those judges that were outliers or that were high allowance rate judges. And we will take those cases and put them to the front of the CDR pipeline. So we will do CDRs.
So give me a date on that. When does that begin?
Oh, we're going to
those-
start that now.
Okay, that's ongoing now. Okay, one other quick question on the medical improvement definition, GAO. You have some thoughts on this as well, Mr. Bertoni, I understand, of how we handle this.
Well, in our report, essentially, there was much confusion about how to apply some of the provisions in terms of the exceptions, how much improvement in medical capacity was sufficient to determine or make a judgment of cessation, and it just wasn't clear. There was a lot of confusion. We surveyed every DDS director and a number of examiners, had a 95% response rate, I believe, and there was a lot of confusion as to how to apply those two critical provisions, and we asked the agency to go in and put some more granularity around those instructions. It hasn't occurred, and we still think it needs to.
How does that happen?
That's in SSA's ball court, whatever, field.
Right. Ms. Lockenfor, it's on your desk. How does that happen?
So it has happened. We have done training on the medical improvement review standard and the exceptions. However, as I mentioned before, we've lost 11,000 people. The lack of funding has resulted in high turnover in the DDSs, so training is not a one-time thing. We need to do continual training. We have been reviewing cases where the medical improvement review standard was utilized, and we are looking at where we need to provide new, improved training and clarity, and we will do that. And we are happy to work with NAID to do that.
Yeah, and the goal here, again, is to get people back out to work. And the disability, we are all on this dais, we are all unanimous. There needs to be a safety net for the most vulnerable. But if there is an expected return to work, how do we help transition people back out to work? And to evaluate it when they're in a vulnerable moment that our society comes alongside of them, but also incentivizes that there is an end date for people that are expected to be able to return. So how do we help you in that process? So the medical improvement in this definition becomes very helpful to us to know that it's not a matter you're 100% back. You're not going to be 100% back. Everyone lives with aches and pains. My ranking member lives with aches and pains all the time from past injuries. She's doing extremely well. So there are other people I've talked about before in my own family, in a wheelchair, all sorts of different medical issues that do extremely well vocationally. How do we help incentivize that and to be able to encourage people to re-engage with culture? Again, going back to what Mrs. Lockhart is. So I'm not saying we have to determine that today. I'm saying from this panel, you need to hear, we want to see a way that medical improvement is clear, and that they see improvement not back to 100%, but see improvement where they can re-engage again for the sake of their families and our economy.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned earlier you talked about the initial decision and not being able to overturn a case on the initial decision. It's really the last decision. And in many cases, in our work, it was the ALJ decision that the DDSs were revisiting in CDR, and the information just wasn't there to determine medical improvement. So I really think the agency needs to look at reconciling the tools that they have at the initial level, and I think they're doing some things there to standardize and to get enough information in the record where you can revisit and determine medical improvement. I think there's real issues at the ALJ level where that tool just doesn't exist yet. I know they're thinking about it, but I think something needs to happen there.
I'm not following you. What tool are you talking about at the ALJ level?
I don't believe there is at this point. At least at the DDS level, we have ECAT, which provides a platform for the examiners to more thoroughly document their rationale for the decision. And if you had to revisit that in a CDR, perhaps you'd have more information to document medical improvement. At the hearings level, at least in our work, that most of the concern was that when the DDS revisited that case in a CDR that was decided at the hearings level, the information was not there. There wasn't enough information to document medical improvement. And the agency, I think, needs to look to additional tools that the ALJs can use to document more thoroughly that rationale. And when you're under pressure to process claims, $700 a month, it's real easy to fly through these claims with limited rationale, and in the event of a CDR, there's not enough there for the DDS representative to make a decision.
So are you saying that the ALJ, because they don't have enough information, tends to continue the benefit but doesn't document it enough? Is that what you're saying?
I'd say in our case, in our review, the concern was that when the DDS examiner received the CDR for review, and the last person who touched it was an ALJ, that decision, that justification did not have sufficient information for them to determine medical improvement. So there could be an opportunity to provide additional tools at the ALJ level so that decision is more thoroughly documented, the rationale is there for the DDS examiner, should there be a CDR, to make a determination of medical improvement.
And the ALJ typically has attorneys write their decisions, correct?
I'll defer to the agency on that. I know that happens. I don't know to what extent.
That's true. There's 4 support staff to every ALJ. I do want to agree with Mr. Bertoni, though, in terms of the importance of documentation. He mentioned ECAT, which is the electronic case analysis tool. It's basically a tool that the DDSs use to thoroughly document the rationale for their decisions. We love that tool because it inspires policy compliance, consistency across the board. We are implementing a version of that with the ALJs. We call it the electronic bench book, but it's essentially the same thing. Think of it as sort of a tool that paths you through the decision and makes you document your rationale.
When? Can I ask
I
that?
have to get back to you on that one. I have to ask Mr. Sklar what his plan is there.
Okay, but we're thinking in the next year, the next 5 years? What are you thinking? Give me a ballpark.
Probably somewhere in between for a full rollout.
Mr.
Might
Chairman,
add that,
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to break in here because I want to ask about the continuing disability reviews, which is the primary purpose for the hearing today, and talk about this annual report on continuing disability reviews report that was done by the SSA that found that the government saved approximately $5.4 billion in fiscal year 2011 alone as a result of completed continuing disability reviews. I think, from what I understand, part of this problem is a huge backlog and a lack of staff resources at the front end of the process where the initial determinations are made. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what are the current barriers then to conducting more medical CDRs?
We need adequate, sustained, and predictable funding, and that is the #1 way to get current on medical CDRs. The only way.
So the chairman and the ranking member sent an 11-page letter yesterday regarding recommendations for improvements to the disability program. What were some of the examples of how SSA is already addressing some of those concerns?
Well, the committee suggested, for example, that we ensure that claimant representatives give us all of the evidence at their disposal, and we have actually already done that. We have a notice of proposed rulemaking out for comment right now. It went out on February 20th. The comment period is open, and so we're already there.
And what is the estimated number of positions that you need based on the current backlog that's in place?
I'll give you a dollar amount. In FY14, we were given the Budget Control Act level of funding, $1.197 billion to do program integrity work. In FY15, we need from the Congress $1.396 billion for program integrity. Subsequent to FY15, the President's budget has a proposal for mandatory sustained funding for program integrity, and we hope that the Congress will support it. That is what we need to get the job done and to eliminate this backlog of medical CDRs.
So despite the fact that every dollar that's spent on CDRs saves the federal government $9, that lack of funding in large part is what's contributing to this $1.3 million or 3 million backlogs of CDRs.
That is the reason.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would just ask that, we enter this report into the record. I agree that there are a number of different policy and operational recommendations that need to be implemented, but I also think that the main thing we need to do as Congress is to properly fund and resource where there is the greatest return on investment, and that is through the CDRs. And that's the front-end part of the process. I know we had an extensive hearing about the ALJs and whatever discretion that they have, and that's an important discussion. But I just feel like the meat of the problem is at the front end, and it's really about a lack of resources to a program that we know when you fund it, it works, and it provides the type of medical reviews that are necessary. So I'll yield back.
Ms. Lockenfora, the Inspector General had put up that one photo of the rock band star, who obviously was provided benefits inappropriately. Have you clawed back that money?
Don't know that specific case. I will say that we identified that case and referred it to the Inspector
All right.
General.
Would you just inform us as to whether or not you have attempted to claw back that money?
Sure.
All right.
We'll look at it.
And then to you, Inspector General, and to you, Mr. Bertoni, you've spent a lot of time in this issue area. And I would like to just know from each of you recommendations you would make to us for improvements to the system beyond what you have provided. And I guess to you, Mr. Bertoni, if there is another issue area that you think we should be requesting you to look at the GAO, we would be happy to make that request of you to kind of make this system work more effectively.
Well, I think we've done a lot of work on the front end of the process, looking at the initial claims process, the SSA's processes for moving claims through the system. I think there's opportunities to gain some efficiencies there. I understand the resource issues. I certainly do. But again, I think there's opportunities for efficiencies there to be able to process claims more quickly and smoothly. I think there's opportunity in the area of quality assurance to make sure that if we are in an environment where we have a backlog situation, we're telling people to process a lot of claims, that we also keep our eye on the quality assurance piece. So that these are not only quickly processed, but accurately processed. And ultimately, I think follow-on work, I would be interested in doing a top-to-bottom review of the medical continuing disability review process, the CDR process. Some of the assumptions, some of the formulas, things that are being used to drive these reviews, I think that would be great work.
Mr. O'Carroll?
Just a couple things, and I guess this is a good time to say it. I think one of the common tones or themes throughout this hearing has been what we talk about all the time. There's a balance between stewardship and service. And one of the things, I guess, that has come out, and I was just looking at my numbers as we're sitting here, is that there's about, we're talking about the 1.3 backlog on CDRs, million backlog on it, and there's about that same, if not more, backlog for initial claims going into SSA. So the agency has to make that balance out between, stewardship and the service part of it. Our job is to keep reminding them about the fraud, waste, and abuse side of it. And I think one of the other, themes from this thing is if we prevent the fraud, one, prevention is best. Let's get the money before it goes out the door and prevent it. That's the reason why the CDI units have been so effective. And along that same line with the CDI units is that we've banked now about $10 billion in savings by using the CDI units. And going back to what Mr. Cummings was talking about in terms of the trust fund on it, that might equate to $10 billion to be about an extension of a month into the trust fund, which is a big deal. So my feeling is that these anti-fraud initiatives are major money savers for the trust fund. And it's something that, are very successful, and we can show it. So anyway, one other thought on the funding part that we were talking about too is that we've suggested a number of times, we put it every year when we go to OMB for our budget presentation, we've put it in each time with our appropriators, is an integrity fund for SSA. And with that integrity fund is with the $3 billion plus that are recovered every year in terms of overpayments, if SSA could have access to some of that money, well, we've suggested it's 25% of that money, and use that for the anti-fraud initiatives like CDRs and other things. It'd fund it, wouldn't need any additional funding for it. One of the other things what we'd like is if the IG could get a percentage of that, we can use that for expansion of the CDI program and being better able to address the 22,000 disability referrals we get from SSA every year. In terms of our, resources that we have, we're doing about 10,000 cases from the resources that we're getting, and we could do a lot more if we had more resources. And I think an integrity fund, instead of coming and asking for a bigger appropriation, would be very helpful.
But what's the source of the integrity funding?
Integrity fund would be the recovered dollars that are coming from the recovery of overpayments. So SSA is banking, 3.26, I think, in overpayments every year that are recovered. So instead of that going back into the trust fund or into the general fund, which some of the fund money goes back to, redirect that back into anti-fraud initiatives.
Okay. I have one last question, unless you have additional things, and that is this issue that would you refer to the bench data system that's trying to line up the ECAT, and then there was the other one?
Oh, the electronic bench book, yeah.
The electronic bench book. Until that is up to speed, we're still going to have an issue with ALJs that have a final, basically, document that we can't track all the reasons for and all the policy documents for. And so when we come back to do CDRs, it's not written in such a way that we can really evaluate medical improvement.
Let me say that we have no indication that that is a widespread problem. Certainly, we want the ALJs to do extensive documentation, and the electronic bench book will help that. But under current policy and process, they are doing that today. Now, there's always going to be cases where we don't do as good a job as others, but I don't have an indication that that's a systemic problem.
Okay. Anyone else experience that? Ms. Nottingham?
I would disagree with that. The most common complaint I hear from other examiners about ALJs is that the allowances are not well documented. I can tell you that the denial decisions that they do usually are well documented, but the allowances, it's very hard for us to make a finding of medical improvement when we don't really know what they were allowed for. It's sometimes difficult to really see what their rationalization was when there's, their rationalization on the decision on a denial might be 9 or 10 pages long, whereas an allowance is generally like 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah, tough to be able to tell on that then, when it's 1 or 2 pages. So when we're dealing with that, how do we process this in the meantime? We have something coming in the future with the bench book. How do we deal with the medical improvement until we get that in place?
I mean, let us get back to you on the bench book, because I don't want to speak prematurely, but I believe we're already well into the rollout of the electronic bench book.
Okay, final questions or thoughts? Anyone else have final questions or thoughts as well? Long day. Thanks for allowing us to be able to pummel you with questions. We want to help in this process, and I appreciate what everybody's doing to be able to serve some of the most vulnerable in our society. So thank you. With that, we're adjourned.